The snow had been falling for 6 hours without stopping. Not the soft, quiet kind that settles gently on windowsills and makes children press their noses to the glass. This was the kind of snow that erased things. It erased the yellow center line on Highway 9. It erased the fence posts along the mountain ridge. It erased the difference between the road and the ditch beside it, turning the entire world outside Silver Creek into one continuous, indifferent white. Ethan Walker drove through it alone. His truck moved slowly, headlights pushing against the dark and the snow and losing most of the argument. The heater ran full blast, but the cold still found the edges of the windows, creeping along the glass in thin fingers of frost. He had both hands on the wheel, and his jaw set the way it always set when he was concentrating. Tight, quiet, unreachable. He was 41 years old, former Navy SEAL, 2 deployments to places he didn't talk about at dinner tables. He had once crawled through a drainage tunnel in complete darkness for 40 minutes with 2 cracked ribs and a broken radio, and he had not panicked. He had learned long ago how to be still inside when everything outside was chaos. But that kind of stillness has a cost, and 3 years after burying his wife Margaret in the small cemetery on the hill above Silver Creek, Ethan was still paying it. He wasn't driving anywhere in particular that night. He did that sometimes, left his daughter Mia with the neighbors, got in the truck and just drove. The movement helped. It was the only time the silence inside him matched the silence outside, and somehow that made it bearable. He came around the long bend below Ridgecrest Pass doing about 20 miles an hour, and that is when his headlights swept across something on the shoulder of the road. He almost didn't stop. His brain told him it was a bag, a piece of tarp, something that had blown off a truck earlier in the day and was now half buried in a drift. He had already begun to look back at the road when the shape moved. He hit the brakes. The truck shuddered. The rear end stepped sideways before the tires found their grip. He came to a full stop in the middle of the lane, engine running, wipers slapping back and forth, and he stared through the windshield at what the headlights were showing him. A girl sat in the snow on the side of the road. She was young, very young, maybe 19, maybe 20. Her coat was a thin canvas jacket, completely wrong for January in the mountains, torn open at one shoulder so that the pale skin beneath showed through. Her dark hair was soaked flat against her face. One arm was wrapped around her pregnant belly, holding it the way you hold something precious and fragile and entirely yours. And in the crook of her other arm, pressed against her chest, was a small brown puppy. It was shaking so violently that Ethan could see the tremors from where he sat. Cars had passed her. The tire tracks in the snow told the story plainly. People had driven around her or past her or had simply not looked. She was not waving, she was not calling out. She sat in the accumulating snow with her back against a guardrail post and stared into the storm with eyes that had already gone somewhere distant and unreachable. The eyes of a person who has asked for help so many times that they have finally stopped asking. Ethan was out of the truck before he made a conscious decision to move. The wind hit him like a wall. He walked to her through the snow, and when he crouched down in front of her, this close, he saw how pale she was. Not cold walk from the car pale, the deep waxy pale of someone who had been outside long enough for the body to start making difficult decisions about where to send its warmth. The puppy looked up at him with wet, exhausted eyes and let out a sound that was barely a sound at all. "Hey," Ethan said gently, "look at me." She lifted her eyes slowly. They were brown and very tired and full of something he had seen before, in other circumstances, in other places, in the faces of people who had reached the absolute end of what they could carry. "You're going to freeze out here," he said. "You and the pup both." She looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above the wind.
"Everybody's already past me," she said. "I stopped counting after a while." Something moved through Ethan's chest. He didn't name it. He just stood up and held out his hand.
"Well, I'm not passing you," he said. "Come on, let's get you warm." She stared at his hand for a moment like she wasn't sure it was real. Then, slowly, she took it. Inside the truck, with the heater pouring warmth into every corner, she still trembled. She held the puppy against her sternum with both hands now, and the puppy burrowed into her with everything it had. Ethan turned the heat up as far as it would go and pulled back onto the road, moving slowly and steadily through the storm. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice even, calm, the voice he used to use to talk to frightened people in frightening places. She took a breath. "Clara?" "I'm Ethan." He kept his eyes on the road. "And who's this little guy?" She looked down at the puppy, and the smallest possible version of a smile crossed her face, so small you could miss it, but it was there. "Buddy." "Buddy," Ethan nodded once. "Okay. You and Buddy are coming home with me tonight, Clara. My daughter's there. There's a fire. You're going to be all right." She turned her face toward the window. Outside, the storm pressed against the glass. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "You don't know anything about me. I know you're 20 years old and 8 months pregnant and sitting in a blizzard on a mountain road at 10 o'clock at night," he said. "That's enough for tonight." She didn't answer, but she stopped trembling quite so hard. His cabin sat at the end of a gravel lane so deep in the pine forest that in summer you couldn't see it from the road. Tonight the lane was buried, and Ethan drove it from memory. When he opened the front door, warmth and firelight spilled out onto the porch, and for just a moment Clara stopped walking and stood in the doorway the way a person stands at the edge of something they are afraid to want. Inside, Mia was asleep on the couch. She was 8 years old, with her mother's dark curls and her father's stillness, and she had fallen asleep surrounded by her crayon drawings, one hand tucked under her cheek. Buddy slid from Clara's arms, crossed the floor on unsteady legs, found the warmth radiating from the fireplace, and simply collapsed beside it with a sigh that filled the quiet room. Mia's eyes opened. She saw the puppy. Everything else in the world ceased to exist. "Dad," she breathed, "there's a puppy." "His name's Buddy," Ethan said, pulling a blanket from the closet. Mia was already on the floor, arms around the small dog, face buried in his fur. Buddy's tail moved weakly, but without hesitation, as though even in exhaustion he understood that this was safe. This was good. "What's his name?" Mia asked, looking up at Clara. "Buddy," Clara said. Her voice caught slightly on the single syllable. Mia smiled the full and uncomplicated smile of a child who has not yet learned to be careful about such things. "Well, Buddy," she said firmly, "welcome home." Clara turned away quickly. Ethan pretended to busy himself at the kitchen counter, but he saw. He saw her press the back of her hand against her mouth. He saw her shoulders rise and fall once, hard, the way they do when you are trying to hold something in that no longer fits inside you. He said nothing. He put a kettle on the stove and let her have the moment. 2 days she stayed mostly quiet. She helped. She was careful and polite and unobtrusive, moving through the cabin like someone who was afraid of taking up too much space. She fed Buddy with a patience and tenderness that told Ethan everything about who she was before he knew any of her story. The story came on the second night, when Mia was asleep and the fire had burned down to coals and the cabin was very still. "My father told me to pack a bag," she said. She was looking at Buddy, who was curled on the hearthrug with his chin on his front paws. "He said I had made my choices and I could live with them somewhere else." She paused for a long time. "My mother stood in the kitchen doorway and didn't say anything. That was almost worse." Ethan sat across from her and waited. "The baby's father told me he wasn't ready."
Her voice was flat and careful. Then he stopped returning my calls. She was quiet again. I found Buddy behind a gas station 3 towns over. Someone had left him in a cardboard box. It was 22 degrees. She looked up then, and her eyes were direct and clear. I couldn't leave him. Of course you couldn't, Ethan said. I had $12, she said. I was trying to get to my aunt's place in Harlan County, but the bus stopped running early because of the weather, and I didn't have enough for a room, and I just... She stopped. She looked at her hands. I sat down for a minute, and then I couldn't get back up. The fire crackled softly. You know what the worst part was? She said. I kept thinking, somebody will stop, somebody will see me, and they just kept going. Ethan leaned forward, his forearms on his knees. You stopped, he said simply. She looked at him. Her eyes filled slowly. Yeah, she said, you did. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised them both. Clara helped with the cooking, and Mia appointed herself Buddy's official caretaker, a role she performed with the seriousness of someone given great responsibility. The cabin filled with small sounds it had been missing for 3 years, the scrape of crayon on paper, Clara's voice singing low in the kitchen, Buddy's nails on the hardwood floor. Ethan watched it all from the edges and felt something in his chest that he had almost forgotten the feeling of. Then in late February, the second storm came. He was in the kitchen when Clara cried out. He crossed the cabin in 4 steps. She was in the hallway, one hand against the wall, breathing in short, controlled bursts, her face completely focused. It's time, she said. The road down the mountain was almost impassable. Ethan buckled Mia into the back seat, helped Clara into the front, and drove. The windshield went white every few seconds. The truck pushed sideways on the curves. He held the wheel steady and drove the way he had been trained to move through danger. Not fast, not reckless, but completely without hesitation. Clara gripped the door handle, and then, at one long blind curve where the truck shuddered in a gust, she reached over and gripped his arm instead. "What if we don't make it?" she said. He glanced at her once. "We're going to make it," he said. "I've driven in worse." "You have?" "Much worse," he said, and something in his voice made her believe it entirely. They made it. 3 hours later, in a warm hospital room with monitors beeping softly and nurses moving with quiet efficiency, a baby girl announced herself to the world. Clara held her against her chest and wept in the way that has nothing to do with sadness, just relief, just love, just the overwhelming reality of a small person who is finally, after everything, here and safe and real. Ethan sat in a chair near the window with Mia asleep against his shoulder and looked at the two of them, this young woman and this new life, and felt something settle inside him that had been unsettled for 3 years. "What will you call her?" he asked softly. Clara looked at the baby for a long moment. Then she looked at Ethan. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." 10 years is not a long time when it is full. Hope grew up running through the pines behind the cabin, with Buddy aging loyally at her heels. She called Mia her sister because there was no other word that fit. Clara became something for which there is also no single word, not quite family by blood, but entirely family by everything that actually matters. And then, one winter, Ethan grew sick, quietly, the way strong men sometimes do, as though even illness respects them enough not to make a scene. By December, he was in a hospital bed, looking out at snow falling on a quiet parking lot. Clara sat beside him and held his hand. "You saved my life," she said. "You know that." He smiled slowly. "No," he said. He looked across the room where Hope slept in a chair, one arm over Buddy's gray muzzle, both of them breathing in the same steady rhythm. "That night, I stopped the truck. He paused. I hadn't had a reason to get out of bed in 3 years. He looked at her. You gave me one. She pressed his hand against her face and said nothing, because there was nothing sufficient to say. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply stop. Stop when the road is dark. Stop when it is inconvenient. Stop when everyone else has already driven past and told themselves it was someone else's responsibility. One man stopped on a mountain road in a January blizzard. He did not save the world that night. He saved one girl, one dog, and one life not yet born. And in doing so, without knowing it, without meaning to, he saved himself. That is how it works sometimes. That is the quiet mathematics of kindness. A stranger becomes family. A broken house becomes whole, and the coldest night of the year becomes the night everything changed. What this story teaches us. This story carries real and lasting value beyond its emotion. It shows us that human compassion is a choice, not an instinct, and that choosing it in a single unwitnessed moment can redirect multiple lives entirely. It teaches children and adults alike that worth is not determined by circumstance. Clara, abandoned and alone, had immeasurable worth. Buddy, discarded behind a dumpster, had immeasurable worth. Veterans like Ethan carry invisible wounds that community and connection can help heal, reminding us to look after those who once looked after us. The story also shows that family is not only biology, but loyalty, presence, and love shown consistently over time. For older viewers, it affirms that purpose can be found again after profound loss. For younger viewers, it asks a simple and powerful question. If you had been driving that road that night, would you have stopped? If this story moved you, please subscribe to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts, where every week we bring you stories of quiet courage, faithful dogs, and the kind of human decency that never makes the headlines, but changes lives every single day. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight, because somewhere out there, someone is sitting in the snow, waiting for one person to stop. Be that person.